Necromancy is a powerhouse for single target bossing and AoE slaying with multiple targets. A lot of players though are still wondering what the ideal bar is for slaying with multiple targets, aka AoE. If you're one of those players, you're in luck because I have done a lot of testing in different Slayer scenarios with multiple targets to find the best bars. Good day everybody. In my previous video, I covered a lot of testing I did to find the best single target, aka bossing bars for Necromancy. Similarly, I did testing in various Slayer scenarios in various tasks with various bars to find the best universal bar. That being said, as with single target combat, there is no one universal revolution bar that is good for every single AoE multi-target situation, so depending on the Slayer task or whatever combat you're doing, you'll have to adjust a little bit. Just use your judgment, but in this video I will give you a rundown of what worked well and what did not work well in different situations, so that you have at least one universal bar hopefully by the end of this that you can rely on and tweak as needed. Typically, the RuneScape 3 wiki has a revolution bars page with ideal revolution bars for single and multi-target combat from PVME. For Necromancy though, these don't seem updated, at least they didn't seem like it to me. Necromancy has recently gone a bit of an overhaul, or at least some tweaking, as it was massively overpowered on release and it was toned down a little bit. I straight up don't like the look of the bar recommendations here for multi-target on PVME, so I did some testing myself. First, I wanted to test something that I thought would not work very well, but wanted to test just so I can say I did it, and that is keeping the skeleton and ghost in the revolution bar. Technically speaking, even having the ghost on your action bar is technically not the best DPS, because the ghost in an AoE scenario doesn't give you high DPS, but it does give you a lot of healing, so it helps you sustain a lot of Slayer tasks. I think most players will use this anyways, so I wanted it in there. The dubious part was the skeleton that is a staple in single target rotations. I wanted to see how this performs in AoE. With that, this is the starter bar that you will see me refine here and there over the course of this video. The first Slayer task I got for testing here was Moss Golems, or rather Creatures of the Lost Grove, but Moss Golems are the best for that. A tough one, I thought, but I went with it anyways. Typically, the only way I AFK these is with magic and animate dead, and you need a very specific setup for that to make sure you survive. So, out of curiosity, I did not cancel the task. I took it to see how it goes. A spoiler I can tell you right now is that I died several times in this task because I was truly AFKing, and yeah, it turns out Necromancy with this setup at least is hard to sustain here. A quick note on that, by the way, my gear and setup is the same for all tasks here. I'm going to leave details on that in the description of this video. I don't want to spend time going over it because it's not the most important part of the video here. Okay, back to testing. The basis for my testing here is that I would take a Slayer task that I thought was good for testing AoE in different scenarios, and I basically did half the task in one configuration with an action bar and half the task in another configuration to test them in parallel. In this case, the first test was this bar with and without the skeleton to see what the difference in kills per minute and kills per hour is. The task was for 111 Creatures of the Lost Grove, so I did about half of them, 50 with the skeleton and 37 without a skeleton. The reason I did 37 only is because I died. Regardless, I made these results comparable by keeping track of exactly how long it took to get each of these kill ranges and calculated the kills per minute and then kills per hour. We can see that without the skeleton, there is a very big difference in kills per hour, a roughly 31% increase once we took it off. This confirms my initial suspicion that the skeleton does a ton of damage to a single target, but it's not worth the extra time in your action bar when you could be using Spectral Scythe or Soul Strike. With the skeleton out of the way, we have two primary AoE abilities in your Necromancy bars, the Spectral Scythe and Soul Strike. The next thing I tested, still at Moss Golems in another task in fact, was whether the order of the Soul Strike matters in your Revolution bar. The Spectral Scythe is always first, I think that's a good recommendation, but I experimented with having Soul Strike before Adrenaline gaining abilities or after. The idea being to see if it's worth it to spam more Spectral Scythe, as much of that as possible, or if it's worth it to spam Soul Strike as much as possible. Both are very powerful. Spectral Scythe has 3 tiers that are used in sequence every time you use Spectral Scythe within a certain cooldown limit, 15 seconds per cast. They require increasing amounts of adrenaline per cast, so 10%, 20%, then 30% for the last Spectral Scythe ability. They're increasingly powerful, and they roughly emulate the melee AoE abilities. The Spectral Scythe also has a chance to fill a soul bar dot. I don't remember exactly what it's called, sorry, but those 3 dots above your head, or 5 if you have a soul bound lantern. These 3 dots are used for Volley of Souls, which will not be mentioned here, and Soul Strike. Soul Strike consumes one of these dots and needs at least 1 dot to be cast, and it hits for pretty high damage, and it hits all targets adjacent to your primary target. The only other way besides the small chance of the Spectral Scythe to fill the 3 dots to get the little dots is using Soul Sap, the ability, which also generates adrenaline. While overall this is not as powerful as the upper tiers of Spectral Scythe, you can spam it a lot. So here are the results of this test. I was able to get 37 kills with each configuration before dying at this terrible task for Necromancy, it turns out. But anyways, with the Soul Strike towards the front before adrenaline gaining abilities, we are looking at about 5.75 kills per minute, aka about 345 kills per hour. With Soul Strike towards the back after the adrenaline gaining abilities, we have 403 kills per minute roughly, which is a 17% increase approximately over the other configuration. So this did make sense to me, since especially with Moss Golems, they clump together in one single spot, so the Scythe can hit them easily, and the upper tiers of the Scythe do a ton of damage. So it makes sense that you would want to prioritize gaining adrenaline and then using the Scythe as often as possible, since it doesn't really have a cooldown, except for the 3rd tier, which has like a 5-second cooldown. And Soul Strike still manages to go off when the last tier of the Scythe is on cooldown, or there's not enough adrenaline, and your other adrenaline gaining abilities are also on cooldown. Now, I wanted to test one more thing before I finished up with Moss Golems, and then I promised I picked better tasks that were more sustainable for this with more kills. But the last thing I wanted to test is something that I do not think the RS Wiki has accounted for yet, which is the Conjure Army ability. Not all players will have this because it requires level 99 Necromancy to use, and it requires the top tier of the Well of Souls to unlock, meaning a lot of talent points and 35,000 souls in the well. And we honestly don't need testing to say that it is much better than using just Conjure and Command Ghost, because it allows you to, in one tick, one attack, summon all 3 of your conjures at once. This allows for a few things. You can have the skeleton, which provides a tiny bit of damage, but it doesn't require an extra attack to summon that. You also get your zombie without blowing it up. I say this because if you're not familiar, if you have your zombie in your revolution bar, it will blow itself up instantaneously because that's what its command does. And that makes it completely unviable for your revolution bar. But the zombie does have really nice AoE poison damage in that besides its regular damage, it applies poison to a small range around its primary target. This poison, by the way, can be boosted with Cinderbane gloves a lot and weapon poison and other poison boosters. The last big benefit for AoE is that by avoiding having the ghost in your ability bar, you don't have to waste a tick using the command of the ghost every time you summon it. The command, most players know, is very powerful as it boosts your damage quite a bit, but only for a single target. So in case you didn't know, in AoE it's not very useful. This round of testing was more brief and I did less kills because I finished the Moss Golem task and kept dying and was really annoyed, but the Conjure Army instead of Conjure Ghost in the bar ended up with about a 8.5% increase in kill times. I could have extended this round of testing more, but it's fairly obvious already that Conjure Army, if you have it, is optimal. So moving forward, that will be thrown into our bars here. If you don't have that yet, just use the Conjure Ghost or remove Conjure Ghost completely from your bar if you're doing an easier task like Abyssal Demons, where you can sustain without the healing from the Ghost. And with that, we're done at Moss Golems. I do not recommend that with Necromancy. While there were some valuable insights gained here, I did not like the sloppiness of how I kept dying, so I went on to pick 2 more Slayer tasks that were more sustainable and varying a little bit in circumstance. And I wanted to rerun the last test I did, which is the placement of Soul Strike before or after the adrenaline gaining abilities. So the first task I found good for this was Hellhounds, 108 of them, so I did half and half with each bar. One thing that's very different about these compared to Moss Golems is that their HP is very low, about 3,500 or 3,300 if I'm not mistaken, which means that tiers 2 and 3 of the Scythe will pretty much kill them instantly, and any Soul Strike will do the same or get you very close. My guess here was that having Soul Strike towards the back would be better, since you could pull off more Scythe, but actually the kill times ended up being very close, but it ended up being 21 versus 20 kills per minute, with Soul Strike towards the front of the bar leading. My next test involved a few more kills with a higher HP target, which was a Salawa'ak in a Soul Devourer task. I killed 80 with each configuration, and in this case, it was about dead even. About 16 or almost 17 kills per minute, a difference of 0.35% between configurations. Thus far, the pattern I see here is that with targets that have very low HP, it is better to prioritize Soul Strike by having that towards the front. But with targets that have very high HP, like moss golems for example, around 30,000, it is better to prioritize Spectral Scythe and Adrenaline building for that, so having Soul Strike at the end of your bar. And based on these results, Salawa Acts are, well, their HP is around the midpoint where it breaks even, about 12,500. My next round of testing began on the remaining 80 Salawa Ak in this task, and it is something nowhere near what's on the wiki recommended bars. And that is that I threw on my Zook Cape and I changed my rotation to have Death Skulls and Living Death, and I removed the Scythe. While this is an awesome combination for short bursts of damage, because you can pull off a ton of Death Skulls in a short time thanks to Living Death, it does leave you with about 30 to 40 seconds in your action bar with nothing. No Scythe, because that eats up too much Adrenaline and takes away from Death Skulls, and you have only Soul Strike as your AoE for, 30 to 40 seconds until Living Death and Death Skulls come off cooldown again. To my great surprise, this actually led to a roughly 5% increase in kill times over the other two configurations. This piqued my curiosity, and since this was a sloppy way to test this configuration, I decided to extend it. I mean, simply because of the fact that I slapped on my Zook Cape for only this test, the extra 5% in kill times could be just from the damage bonus that the Zook Cape provides. Anyway, this is why my next test was at the next appropriate task that I found, which was Dark Beasts. These represent a totally different configuration of task than the others in the sense that these attack with magic from a distance. They don't all melee you and clump together like the previous tasks I tested on. So I also wanted to test a task like this where the enemies are more spread apart. The task was for 194 Dark Beasts, so the first 100 I did with Death Skulls and Living Death. The rest of the 94 I did with the previous Scythe and Soul Strike configuration, with Soul Strike being before the Adrenaline gaining abilities because their HP is not that high, about 8,500. The results here are close, but went the other way, with almost a 5% difference in kills per hour, with the Scythe and Soul Strike leading over the Death Skulls and Living Death rotation. This is, again, actually contrary to what I was expecting because the Dark Beasts are so spaced apart, but I actually learned something about Soul Strike that is very interesting through this test. The description of Soul Strike says that it hits adjacent targets that are within one tile of the primary target. This, for enemies that take up more than one square, typically means that adjacent enemies are only hit if they are adjacent to the primary square of that target. Like each mob has one square that is its primary square. So things like Chinchampas and Ice Barrage and things like that will only hit multiple targets if they are next to that primary square and not any other. What I found with Soul Strike is that its range of, quote, one space is huge, actually. So regardless of the configuration of things being next to each other, as long as they're remotely close to each other, Soul Strike still hits. This I was not expecting, but it makes a huge difference. Now, in my book, this about wraps up my testing, but there is one more that I wanted to run, and I ran it on the Salawa Axe because they are a good target, and I ran my Death Skulls Living Death rotation on them because that was the winner at these things before, and I compared that directly with exactly what is recommended on PVME for Zook Cape. I am against this rotation for a lot of reasons, mainly that I think it's outdated. B, there is no Ghost or Conjure army in there, and while it's probably true that not having the Ghost is better for your DPS, it also makes a lot of tasks more unsustainable. I found that to be the case with this one, even though Salawa Axe are the least hard-hitting of the Soul Devourers that are easy to AoE even with melee. I was struggling to keep up even with Soul Split or Deflect Melee and the Vampirism Aura. My health was slowly dwindling towards 0. Additionally, with the Scythe being placed in front of the Death Skulls, it makes me think that whoever wrote this rotation did 0 testing on it, because if the Scythe is in front of Death Skulls, that means that you will never have enough Adrenaline for Death Skulls except at the beginning of the fight if you go in with 100%. And as this test went on, my suspicion was confirmed because Death Skulls was never fired off at all. There was never enough Adrenaline, even with the Zook Cape reducing the cost. This basically just became the same as my other optimal bar, but minus Command Army, which is inferior. Okay, that's all the testing. So, in conclusion, this was quick and dirty, I'll admit. The sample sizes I have here are not amazing, but as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, there is no one Revolution bar that will cover all your Slayer tasks or all your AoE needs. So while I could have tested for 1,000 kills instead of 100 for each of these creatures, or 10,000, whatever, it would not be worth it in my book, because as soon as you encounter a slightly different AoE situation, you'd have to change your bar anyways. That being said, there could be way more optimal bars out there than mine here. Well, not way more, maybe slightly more, but it'll still be on you a little bit to adjust your bars to each situation. What I hope you got from this video is what abilities worked better than others in certain situations. It's not a very common task, but for example, you could take Aviancy if you just need a really easy AFK-able task for some points, and in a case like these, The avians here spread very far apart. Now, here I tested without Death Skulls and Living Death, just with the Scythe and Soul Strike, but in hindsight, maybe Death Skulls would have actually been better here overall because they're so spread apart that the Death Skulls will just bounce around and get a bunch of the avians I haven't gotten to. A small example, but just to state that there are many other different scenarios of AoE combat that you'll have to adjust for. The best takeaway besides that I can give you here is that regardless of whether you choose to do your combat with Living Death and Death Skulls because you have a Zoop Cape or stick to the Scythe and Soul Strike, I'm gonna say it doesn't matter too much. I know a lot of you don't want to hear that because you're going for hundreds of thousands of kills or whatever, and a 5% difference in kill times makes a big difference. The only thing I can say on that note is that the Scythe is better for high HP targets like Moss Golems or say Abyssal Beasts. For mid-range or low HP targets, just have Soul Strike before your adrenaline gaining abilities, but still after the Scythe. If you have Conjure Army, totally put it at the front. If you don't, use a Ghost only if you need the HP sustain. That's it. That's all. Please let me know what you think. If you have found other bars and configurations that work well for you, leave it in the comments. It'll help everybody. And if you found this video particularly helpful, please consider giving it a like and my channel a subscribe for more helpful RuneScape videos. Thanks very much for watching. If you made it all the way through, I appreciate you very much, and I'll catch you in the next one. Good luck.